Very happy to be here with you, Design.
Likewise, definitely.
It's the first time we've had a formal conversation, though we've shared a lot of jokes
Lots.
together in the past with some very, I think, informative conversations about art and art practice. So I'm happy to give this to a public audience. I think that oftentimes these artist talks usually take the form of, this is my work from when I started in school, this is what I did next, and this is what I did next. I think we want to break that up a little bit.
I do. I think we do. I think we want to make it a little more personal.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And make it thematic. So we thought a very good place to start is actually in the present. We're going to start with the project you have in situ right now. This is La Perla. Can you tell us a little bit about what it is and how it came about?
So La Perla came about, well, first of all, I've heard that either people love it or it's angered a lot of people, which I think is the power of making art. I think that's the reason you make work, is to get a conversation going. So I was definitely happy to hear that news. And, you know, you have to understand that when you're making work like this, you have to go in it with the feeling and knowing you have to put money aside. And obviously when you see a work like this, you know that you have to think about the life that it takes on afterwards, after you produce a work. Storage, where do you put it? You know, can you find it a home? Can you put it somewhere? So I think that instead of just looking at the work and just thinking about the candy-coated colors and the customization, you also have to think about that it has a life of its own. And you have to really understand when you're producing a project, what level and how far to the left are you willing to go to produce something. So for me, what was really important to me is when I was producing this piece, La Perla started off, it's had a few different lives. When I produced the first boat was for the Venice Biennale, which was in 2007. Keeping true to the idea of customization. So I've gotten really interested in the idea of people that produce work in a very unorthodox manner, which mainly takes on a lot of appropriated cars or vehicles. And I was very interested in why these people were making these pieces. And what I love about the culture is most of the people who have these vehicles, they have 9-to-5 jobs. They come from a very blue-collar family. They know nothing about the art world. And this is what I really love about the culture, is they produce pieces that they have for a lifetime. They literally invest half of their life savings into something, which they will never get a return on. It's a labor of love. Some of the times when they're producing vehicles, what they'll do is they'll actually hand engrave the whole bottom of the vehicle, and they'll coat it in 24-karat gold plating.
I mean, the part of the vehicle that's never seen.
And the part that's never even seen. So, you know, again, so when you look at this, for me, there's 3 or 4 different stories behind this piece. It's not just what you see sitting at the fair.
Can you talk to us a little bit about some of the features of this object? Because it's rather complex.
It is very complex. It's the initial boat I put on the canals in Venice, and what I did is I was very interested in the idea of the diaspora and how the diaspora works. And my parents are first-generation immigrants from Puerto Rico, and the story that I wanted to tell behind it was their transition from Puerto Rico to Chicago and back and forth. And La Perla is we can actually go to the third slide. La Perla is a section of Puerto Rico on the island, which is it's one of the major slums in Puerto Rico. It would be like a favela, and it is the poorest community in Puerto Rico, but they sit on the richest part of the island. And for me, I love the juxtaposition when I created the boat of telling the story, but telling it in a way that would capture the mind. And I love the fact that the boat is completely in excess. And for me, I think that's a contradiction, I think, with the piece.
This idea of like material lack produces material excess.
Yes. And it's a complete contradiction.
Absolutely.
And it's supposed to be that way. And the boat, I put 20 subwoofers. There is, yep, there is 20 subwoofers. There's custom, the steering wheel says Barrio Dreams. It's automotive pearlized paint. The interior is completely suede. I put a 357 Chevy engine in the boat.
And then there are these video aspects of it too.
I found 20 reels of Super 8 film in my father's attic. And when I pulled them out, I just, the quality of the film and the graininess of it and the fact that it was completely silent for me was something that you could be Puerto Rican, American, Jewish. It didn't matter where you came from, what your background is. Everyone can relate to the film. It doesn't matter what it is. I mean, you could be, and for me, I love the memories that the films bring back for me personally. And a lot of the film I edited, so the film goes back and forth from my parents living in Puerto Rico to Chicago, their first trip to New York, back to Puerto Rico again. And if you get a chance, the boat is here at the fair. It's across from booth 211. The film is maybe 3 minutes long.
I want to next talk about its life a bit in Venice and how you kind of made this intervention into gondola culture.
Yeah, well, the first thing I have to tell you is that the police shut us down at the biennial when we had this when I had this piece because we cranked up the music to the max capacity.
You said 20 subwoofers,
yes.
right?
And so I was like, I kind of have to keep it a little gangster in Venice. Right. So it was, we shipped it, when we shipped it, we knew that we were going to have some problems, but that was, for me, I really wanted to keep true to the idea behind the boat and behind the mechanics and behind the concept of how it's created, but also I wanted to keep true to the voice of the people that I worked with who are making this piece. And for me, I think if I kept it in a white cube and we kept it very sterile, it would lose its soul. And I think you have to give people the benefit of the doubt. The public is a lot smarter than you think. And so when they see something that's watered down or sterile, it doesn't come off as honest. And for me, I just kind of thought, well, if I was a fabricator making lowrider cars, would I have the volume very quiet and dim and very careful and very sterile? No, I would definitely have it very loud and obnoxious, and so we had a smoke machine on the boat, and it had a laser light show, but it had a life of its own, which was great, and obviously it got a lot of attention in Venice, which was the idea of producing the piece.
That's useful, but I'm also really interested in this notion that you talked about of diaspora culture and how a certain type of an aesthetic can move from one place to another, be translated and kind of figured inside of objects. And in that same way, you've now taken this diasporic object or this diasporic aesthetic to Venice and then inserted it into a different kind of cultural tradition that is, again, true to the cultural tradition. It's a water culture. It's one in which there are sort of party boats and party gondolas and so forth. So there seems to be a kind of sensitivity to different contexts, and I'm wondering if that's something you're sensitive to.
I'm definitely very sensitive to it. I think over the course of my career, recently I've been really connecting to social identity, and I've been really connecting to my background and where I come from, and being from a family from Puerto Rican culture is really important to me. And I'm not sure if I was telling you this the other day that, as much as I want to produce work that can go out of context from this, it just doesn't feel very honest to me. And so it's really important for me that when I'm producing work, and especially when I'm producing work, when I think of my mother or my father, and just the way that I grew up and the way that they grew up, and my father being a factory worker and my mother working at Jewel for 35, 40 years, and them not really knowing about the art world. I think what's really important for me, and this is going to go back to answer your question about the diaspora, is that I really love making love producing work that that invites the public or invites a community of people that would never step foot into an institution, to the MCA or to the gallery, because a lot of times people feel that they're not part of something, and especially being Latino and being Puerto Rican specifically, it's really important to me that people that are my relatives or friends or people I grew up with feel very comfortable in entering an institution to come look at my work and not feel that and not feel that they don't belong. And I think that's important for me. Making that kind of work is really important for me.
Right, basically creating objects where someone can see a sense of themselves in contemporary art practice,
Sure.
which is brilliant. I think these questions of heritage are super important and super complex, and I wanted to talk a little bit about some of these heritage sources, both art historical and pop cultural a little bit. So,
well, and from a fabrication standpoint, the beautiful thing about working with, initially I was getting my work fabricated, but now what I've done is living in Chicago, which is very important to me, and also I think financially, which is important to me, because I see how much people pay rent in New York. I'm able to have a studio that allows me to produce exactly what I want and exactly how I want it, and I hope I'm not going off track on this, but this is really important for me to talk about. I've set my studio up, and my practice is set up in a way that everything done is in-house. Everything I produce is in-house now. So I basically reproduced an auto body shop in my studio. I've set up a wood shop, so I can produce exactly what I need to. Instead of sending it out to LA or to Houston or San Antonio, I can do everything in-house now. The plus side is that I can do everything on site. The downside is that it's hard to find people who can produce something specifically how I need it, or sometimes I have to do it myself, which is completely fine. But obviously when you're taking on a large project like this, you need several hands to help you out. The one thing about fabricating something like this and outsourcing it, the plus side is that they don't care about the art world, which I really love. But the bad thing is they don't care about the art world. So they don't care about deadlines. They don't really care about what show you have coming up. They don't care if you have to have it ready by 3 o'clock and there's a shipper coming to pick it up. They just don't care.
So then you've been able to pull all of this in-house, and everyone works as a kind of studio.
It's really a community, and it's really a family in the studio, and that's really, really important to me because, and believe it or not, what's most important to me is when I'm producing projects in my studios, not so much of the skill set, but it's more of the sense of community that people are bringing into my studio. That's most important to me.
Right. I also wanted to talk about some art historical references to this work, specifically thinking about two gentlemen who think a lot about finish, color, sheen, customization. And the image on the left is an early work by John Chamberlain, who's more well known for his large scale, basically what I call car crash, muy machismo, like car crash sculptures. But a lot of folks don't know that he actually started doing these small paintings, which were made with automotive paint and paralyzed automotive paint as well. And so he's thinking a lot about a kind of street culture or even industrial culture. That begins to influence the way his work is made instead of going towards sort of minimalism, which was the East Coast version of a kind of, industrial version. He went toward the surface. John McCracken in LA, of course, the finish fetish, sanding things down, buffering it until actually it reflects so much that it's a mirror.
It's a mirror finish.
Exactly.
A lot of the LA artists, the early LA artists, they've had a huge impact on my studio practice. I've had the chance to have an exhibition with Ed Ruscha and actually have time to talk with him in length and at depth about his practice and from the 50s and the 60s, which involved a lot of car culture. Billy L. Bankston, who produced a lot of his early books, his handmade books, which people don't really quite know that. Billy L. Bankston is somebody who, for me, is one of those artists that's completely under the radar. He's been producing work for the past 40 years with automotive paint. And the one thing that's really interesting is that when you look at the work that I'm producing And I have to say that you kind of get this sociological and you almost, and I'm trying to choose the words the right way because I don't want to say something wrong that people get offended. But you know,
I'll make it diplomatic.
Okay, people can put you into a box. So when you look at my work and you're thinking he makes work that deals with customization, right away you think of lowriding community. You think of him being Latino, and people can put you in a box. But if you look at Ed Ruscha or Billy L. Bankston and they're using automotive paint, you wouldn't say that about them. You don't think of them as lowriders. You just think of them as artists who are producing work in a very unorthodox manner. So that's something that is a very touchy thing for me personally.
Absolutely, because I also remember Rosalind Krauss writing about Ed Ruscha's early work, the books, the 26 gasoline stations, or 24, I can't remember how many it was, and saying this is work that's about car culture.
Yeah.
Right? It's about America being the place of the automobile.
Very Americana.
And that becoming the conceptual way in which we now perceive our landscape.
Yes.
But of course, no one would ever read an association with cars back onto Ed Ruscha culturally.
No.
Right. And that's the touchiness, I think, that we often come across when thinking about artists of color and how culture gets read back onto them instead of back onto the object.
And I'm not saying that always happens to me, but I think my work has been able to cross over into pop culture and into the masses, which I very much appreciate. But what's funny is that people don't know that Ed Ruscha and Billy L. Bankston and a lot of the early LA artists were very influenced by the Rat Rod movement. And the Rat Rod movement turned into the lowrider movement, and that has turned into custom car culture, which is, turned into TLC programs.
There's a better future somewhere. Another thing I think about a lot, of course, in your practice is a pattern and design movement.
And the idea of craft making.
Exactly. Excuse me, pattern decoration. I'm looking at you and reading you into art history. But there are two things that are important there. And one, of course, is this question of decoration, all overness, pulling these sort of articles from domestic culture and personal life onto the canvas and onto public art. Or excuse me, I should say onto art objects that go into the public. But the second thing that was really important about that movement, even though that it was a kind of intergender movement, male and female both, it was really considered part of a kind of feminist practice.
Yes.
Which I think is amazing.
Which is really, and the role of a woman plays a very important part of my life. In fact, people who've never met me, when they see my work, they think that I'm a female. Just based on the work, and because I use a lot of craft-based material, glass beads, crystals, sequins, and for me, what I love about I used to get slightly offended if people had associated my work with craft-based material, but now I completely embrace it.
What was the shift for you?
I think the shift for me was definitely realizing and coming to terms with my identity of what has really influenced me. A lot of my work and a lot of the pattern-based work that you see is based on, again, the way that I grew up in my household. My mother had these really obnoxious wallpapers on the wall, and a lot of floral patterns, and a lot of them had felt or the
velvet.
A lot of velvet.
Chanel.
A lot of brand new rugs with plastic runners on them. Beautiful couches completely covered in plastic. And I'm actually working on a large installation that's coming up for my show at the Dallas Contemporary, and it's a huge room and a huge wall, and the piece is called "Shit That I Find in My Relative's House."
So exactly.
And it really is shit that I find in my relative's house. So I've just been documenting. I'm making a small flip book about it, but it is, and it's like they're porcelain roosters. I mean, I had my mother, I think for her 40th birthday, got a white porcelain cougar. But again, it's these things of just like, you think about the idea behind it, and you're just like, who buys somebody a white porcelain cougar for their birthday?
Someone who modernism never really affected.
Exactly. I don't know about you guys, but it happens a lot in the Puerto Rican community. So those are the things that I've completely embraced, and those are the things that make me happy. Those are the memories that make me feel good. And so again, when I'm producing work and there is a craft-based quality to it, I'm not ashamed of it anymore. And it really is me being as honest as I can with myself and being as honest as I can with the public. So and it makes me feel very comfortable. And I think as I get older, I think I want to be more. I just want to be happy and more comfortable with myself. So
and honest.
Yeah, and honest.
Speaking of shit you find in your relative's home, you turned that into an art project.
So this piece was produced in Art Basel last year, which, you know, not trying to pat myself on the back, but I'm going to. It was a huge hit. And I think, and the reason I say that it was a huge hit and the reason I'm so proud of it is because I think this is the epitome of when you produce work that is completely honest and what can happen and what the repercussions can be from it. This completely has reminded me of why I produce work and why I'm an artist. This project started off, this project came from a culmination of things. I used to show with Deitch Projects in New York, and Jeffrey Deitch always had an amazing budget to work with. Slightly obnoxious, in fact. But that was his program, and that's why I loved working with him. When I did my first show with Jeffrey, I literally did a car, a bicycle, a boat, and everything was just completely over the top. And I did these really large paintings that I could never ever produce ever again. And I'm sorry, that I could never produce for a show at that size, probably for a long time. I wanted to get the same effect within a smaller. I wanted to produce the same effect, but in a much smaller space. And the one thing I did is I literally sat down and I just started writing down things that made me happy. And then I started writing down ideas that brought back very good memories for me. And the one thing that stuck repeatedly was my mother had a bootleg nail salon in my house growing up. So in order to supplement extra income, my mother opened up, when she first arrived from Puerto Rico, she had her beautician's license, which she was very proud of, but she was never able to take it somewhere else. So she got a job at Jewel, working in the grocery department. But what she would do, though, is every weekend she would have the bootleg nail and hair salon shop in the house. And then it expanded to doing it during the week. And one of my favorite memories was going home at a half day of school from kindergarten and watching General Hospital and hanging out with all the ladies in the house and smelling the chemicals from perm and just like nail clippings everywhere. And there's a word that you say in Spanish called bonchinchera, which means gossiper. So all these women would just sit down and just talk shit about all the coworkers, and they would talk about their ex-lovers and their husbands and boyfriends. So that what inspired me, and that was an idea that I wanted to reproduce. So luckily, I met Jeannie Greenberg from Salon 94, and she just said, you know, if you could do anything for our show, what would you do? And I immediately said, I want to produce a pop-up nail salon shop at the gallery. And she was on board 100%. And then we did an annex exhibition at the new museum. Now, when I was working on the project, what I didn't realize was I was looking for inspiration. So I was looking up nail culture, homemade nail culture, hair culture, and there was no information on it. So I started putting together what turned out to be this book called Nailed, which I didn't realize actually turned out to be the first book produced on nail culture and the history of nail culture. And it literally goes back from the beginning of time up until now into my project at the new museum, which is very overwhelming. And you can even read in the first 2 pages, it's a complete homage to my mother. So what I did is, in order to keep it, if you can just go back just quickly, in order to keep completely true to the idea and the concept of the project, for the book signing and the launch at Art Basel Miami, I literally reproduced my living room from 1976. So this is exactly what it was like. It's the original TV, it's the original mirror, the original chandelier, Ponce de Leon, who's been in the family for 40 years. That's my grandfather up on the wall. And you have to understand that 70% of my dad's living room is completely gone right now. It's been chopped up and it's half empty. And because this project is in LA right now, and then it goes to Berlin.
And it's coming to Chicago.
And it's coming to Chicago, yes, next year.
I'll also mention that this really incredible book is here at the MCA bookstore, and Design's going to be signing copies of this right here outside the bookstore to my left and your rights.
And I have to say, if you seriously, I mean, and just so you know, producing a book is a completely narcissistic thing. You don't make any money on these things unless you're the publisher. So just so you know, I haven't made a dime off this, but it's a great idea. And if you really want a good coffee table book and have on a Friday night or Saturday night when you're having cocktails, definitely get the book.
It's
a
pretty
good topic.
fierce, but one thing that I think is absolutely extraordinary, aside from the history that's covered in this book, is that it goes back to this question of customization.
Yes,
again,
which is part of my studio practice.
Precisely, and this time, instead of it being on the large-scale industrial level,
yes,
it's now on the scale of the body. And it's usually on the scale of a woman's body, which is why we
Tilda
have an
Swinton.
image here.
Yes.
Yeah, Tilda Swinton getting her nails did.
Yes.
Because you had this elaborate sort of pieces that weren't just, it wasn't just about getting a manicure, right? It was about getting these decorative appendages on your body.
And it was about the experience, and it was about a sense of community, and it was about her being invited to my mother's house to get her nails done.
Right.
When she literally had she heard about the project, and she got on a plane and came straight to Art Basel and wanted to really experience and be part of the project, which was really important to me. I've never met the woman. I don't even know her on a very personal level. I had just met her that one time. But just for the fact, from an artist supporting another artist was really important to me. What was most important, though, is that Regina and, I'm spacing on the other girl's name. When I went to Miami, I wanted to find the local texts. So I literally got in my car and I drove for about 5-7 hours, and I just scoured the city. And I ended up finding 2 nail techs that worked at the flea market, I think on 71st, way, way south in Miami. And they were the ones that I wanted. And they came and they literally were in my mother's living room doing nails. And I love the fact that this is their first experience in the art world. This was something that was completely new to them. And that alone was part of the project, and that's part of the story. And I love the fact that one of the girls sat down with Tilda Swinton for an hour and a half, and they literally, what they did is they talked about how they grew up, and they talked about their life stories. And she talked about what it was, the girl was asking her, what is it like in Europe, and what is it like in Scotland? And then she's asking Regina, so where do you live, and how do you get around, and how do you make a living, and how do you support yourself doing this? Those are the memories that, and I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it. Those are the memories that I get when I was a child listening to my mother and the woman talk in the kitchen. And that's exactly why I produced the book and I produced that project.
Amazing, amazing. I want to go back a little bit and talk about some other predecessors, so not even just on a kind of material level, but also on a more conceptual level, some folks that we talked about as being predecessors, and one that stood out very strongly was Pepón Osorio.
Yeah, big influence in my work.
Massive influence, and I'm sure, just comparing this image, this installation badge of honor to the Nailed project, you can already see the level of, first, a sense of domestic. There is also the sense of installation rather than object-based. And I'm wondering if you can expand a little bit on the influences.
One of my first experience with Pepón Osorio's work, and which, by the way, again, I don't know him personally, but for me, it's important to acknowledge the people that have come before you and the people that have influenced you. I think a lot of artists tend to forget that, they're not the best thing since sliced bread, and that they have to remember that there are people that have come before you that have produced work that might be in the same language, the same vein, and I think it's very important that people acknowledge where influence comes from. And for me, Pepón Osorio produced a project called No Crying in the Barbershop, which is one of my favorite pieces, and I think it's in the museum in the Museo de Puerto Rico in the permanent collection. What I love about Pepón's work is he literally, Pepon for me is an artist. He's the person that takes the chances and takes everything to the left and keeps going to the left and doesn't stop. And what I love about his work is he really truly captures the essence of social identity, and I think his work can translate beyond being Latino or being Puerto Rican. But specifically, you know, I take it to heart because obviously I am Puerto Rican, but I think what makes my work different from what he's producing is my work is definitely a lot more finished. There's obviously, it's a lot cleaner. I kind of feel like I'm almost a torchbearer in a sense. I feel that I'm producing work that can relate to people that are my age and my generation, and he's producing work in his way for people that are in his generation.
Absolutely. I think the one thing that you do very much share is this question of how do you pull personal narrative and cultural narrative into the work that you produce. But speaking of your generation,
yes,
I thought I'd put up images
yes.
of some of your contemporaries who kind of share the sense, again, of a kind of 1 foot in art history,
yes,
1 foot in cultural history,
yes,
but also a sense of excess, right? On the one
yes.
hand, we have Luis Gisbert. This is a work that's actually on offer at Rona Hoffman's booth, which is, you know, thinking about youth culture, hip-hop culture,
sure.
But also an homage to Bruce Nauman. There's a massive, amazing work here, of course, Mickalene Thomas, who's going through a sort of modernist history of painting, the portrayal of a woman's
who's
body.
able to bring in so many historical
Absolutely.
aspects of her, you know, just so many historical references in her work and bringing it to contemporary stage.
Absolutely. And then Mark Swanson, who's producing these objects. He's thinking about his kind of semi-rural upbringing.
Yes.
But also this kind of sense of excess. I think all of these artists and you share a kind of interest in excess.
And they actually happen to be very good friends of, I mean, well, Luis and Mickalene are very good friends of mine, and they're my contemporaries. But what I love about their work is, I mean, obviously there's a relationship because we produce work in the same language, but what I love about them on the personal level is we all support each other. There's no egos. There's complete camaraderie between all three of us. And in fact, Mickalene and Luis are in the book. Luis, it's okay. For me, what's important is that Luis and Mickalene and Mark Swanson are producing this work that is in excess that I think goes back to the next image that you're going to show.
Absolutely. A kind of, well, I was joking before, but I realized maybe I was serious about the fact that there's a certain cultural tradition where modernism never really quite hit.
Yes.
And so, and that is, for me, a language of the Baroque.
Yes.
I had a conversation recently with the Cuban artist Joan Capote who said that. He said that Cubans are very Baroque people. And I think that's an interesting statement.
Wait, do you mean Baroque as in broke?
No, no, not B-R. B-A-R. Also true, though. So, but we started the conversation about this question of excess in the context of material lack. And but I'm wondering, where does this excess come from?
I mean, obviously, if you look at the history of Baroque painting and the idea of the Baroque style, the whole reasoning behind it, which is really important, is that there's a connection to Catholicism, there's a connection to the Roman Catholic Church, and it's the idea of power, the idea of triumph, which could be, if it's used the wrong way, could be a bit of a scary thing. I like using it, and I'm influenced by it because I love the fact that it draws the viewer in. And once you draw the viewer in, then you can tell your story and you can explain your story to the viewer, which is really important for me. It's the same thing as being a photographer, and whether you have an image that is either racy or it's racial or it's large, but as long as it's a very strong image, when you grab the attention of that viewer and you bring them in, once you have their attention, then you start asking the questions: why is this produced? What does it mean? What materials did they use? And that's when you can tell your story, and that's when you have your chance to tell your story instead of people just walking by and not really taking notice. And I think, for me personally, that's one of the reasons that I make work that's pretty much an excess. I mean, when you see Bernini's Saint Teresa, I mean, this is the anchor of the Baroque movement. And I gotta tell you, there's a lot of artists even to this day, that can't really fuck with things like this. I mean, you walk into a church and you're just completely blown away by the excess of, I don't know if any of you have ever been to Vienna, but every other corner is completely made of excess with gold and marble.
I mean, a lot of that, of course, has to do with all these very strange and sometimes unfortunate empirical campaigns and exercises. Yes. But on a very aesthetic level, I think it has a lot to do with this question of how does one reach the sublime? Yes. And I'm wondering if you think about that at all in your own practice, especially with this element of psychedelia, these elements of light, the materials that even that come into the surface of the work.
Well, I think that's actually a very good question, and I think for me, what I'm more interested in is the idea of this altar making, and for me, I think that the play on psychedelia kind of comes in. The idea of psychedelia is kind of an afterthought for me personally. Even right now, I'm very interested. I'm working on a project called Victory. It's a show at the Dallas Contemporary Museum, and it's the idea of triumph and the idea of winning and the idea of these shields that I'm producing. But a lot of the paintings have kind of a psychedelic effect because there's so many layers on the paintings. I would say that currently I'm more in tune with the idea of altar making than anything.
Fascinating.
Yeah, and especially when you see things like Santeria and you see these altars made that are offerings to people. And then you see the altars from these churches, like in Melk. If you can go back quickly, one. I mean, I don't know if you this should be on somebody's bucket list, because if you ever get a chance, you should go to Melk in Vienna. I have never ever in my life experienced anything like this. And just so you know, this is just one small portion of the church. And again, this is psychedelia. Yeah, I mean, you walk in. I mean, you completely feel like you're on LSD when you're walking through the church. I'm not kidding. Seriously.
Oh boy. I have so much to say about that, but I'm not going to.
I mean, no, but really, look at, this is,
right.
probably, 1 square foot of the church. I mean, and that is just
and incredibly intricate.
And look how intricate it is. And that's just one tiny portion of this church. And that's what, sometimes I use curse words to kind of emphasize how I really feel. But I really do feel that, being an artist and producing work, when you look back in history and you look at the Renaissance work and you look at the Baroque movement and you look at Caravaggio's work and you look at the history of when they were producing certain work for certain time periods, there's just some things that just stand the test of time. And I think a lot of artists need to really think about their practice on how it's going to withstand the test of time over the next 50 years, the next 100 years, the next 500 years. And that goes into also using the right material and using archival material. And this goes back into the studio practice, which I think a lot of artists, and I have to say there's a lot of young artists that, there's some work that I just don't get, and there's some work that obviously that I do get and I do respect and understand, but there's a lot of artists producing work that do not think about archival material.
Well, what if that artist wanted to make something that was ephemeral?
I think that they're doing it subconsciously. I think that they're doing it, I think they realize that they're doing it that way after they produce the work.
This is really interesting. We'll have that argument later.
Okay.
But to move the conversation forward, I also wanted to talk about the Baroque on a grand scale and on a small scale. And
yes.
And you, of course, talked a lot about sort of a kind of craft practice that you're now wanting to acknowledge in your work, a woman's practice.
Yes.
So we talked a little bit about bobbin lace before. What is your interest in this?
This evokes very fond memories of my trips to Puerto Rico. I go maybe twice a year. Most of my relatives have bobbin lace on their tables, at their house, on their couches. But what people don't really understand is that, again, there's a very long history about this practice, which started off in Eastern Europe and then was taken by the nuns to Spain, which, then you have the Inquisition, which made its way over to the Caribbean, which brought not only this, but also brought I mean, you have Puerto Rican Jews, and you have, that for me, the bobbin lace is just as important as having a community of Jewish people in Puerto Rico. Those are the issues that I'm personally interested in now these days with my practice.
Issues as in the objects that hold
the objects that hold the cultural memories and the identity behind it. There's this one is this is a piece that I produced by hand, and this is a piece that I produced by hand from memory of my aunt's tablecloth in Puerto Rico, which is covered in 24 karat gold. And again, the reason that I apply 24 karat gold is to draw the viewer in. But once they're drawn in, I love the fact that if they ask me a question about it, I love the fact that I can tell them that it's made from memory, that it's made by hand. But again, there's certain people that don't really realize this. A lot of people would walk by the wall and just look at it and say, oh, craft-based piece, it's a bobbin lace, it's covered 24 karat gold, it's very much an excess. But actually, there's a very personal story behind the work.
Absolutely. It's beautiful. Speaking of personal stories, I was interested in how you acquired the name Design.
Yeah.
Who's he?
So, design for me. Design is an homme de plume. It's the tag name that I adopted when I was very young. When I was about 13, I saw a documentary on PBS about graffiti culture and street and about train culture, and this had a profound impact on me. And you have to understand, growing up on the southwest side of Chicago and having parents that never took me to museums, that knew nothing about the art world or art galleries, I pretty much had to educate myself on the art world. And for me, it's very important that I acknowledge that history and that I acknowledge that part of my life. And that is one of the reasons that I've never really changed the name. I actually got my middle name officially changed when I was in my early 20s. And I partially did it to piss my mother off, and then I partially did it because I wanted to adopt this identity. When you look at, you look at art in general, and you look at, for God's sakes, Bob Dylan isn't even Bob Dylan's real name. But I love the fact of this alter ego and playing this different kind of role within my work. I love the fact that I can actually step out and produce something else, or it becomes one. For me, it's really important that it's part of my history. It's something that has always been a part of my history and that I've adopted. And for me, my real name is Carlos. In case you guys
news is out. You heard it here first.
Yeah. So, but for me, there's no separation between the identity and the name, and I think that's really important for me. And the name and the work, I think what's most important is when you're producing the work, it's really about the work and it's not about the name. And I've actually thought about this as well. Sometimes I've forgotten to actually sign my work, which for me shouldn't be an issue. And just because it's important that people recognize that it's really about the work and it's not about someone's name.
And lastly, I wanted to talk a little bit about the context of art fairs. Yes. You promised me one day that you would tell me a story about your experience with art fairs in '93, and I don't know this one either, so I'm interested in you sort of relaying your relationship to art fair practice now that it's back in Chicago.
I had when I had heard the fair was coming back to Chicago, Tony Carmen had pulled me aside, and Tony Carmen is I'm not sure if he's the director. He's the director, but I'm not sure his complete affiliation. But he's the executive director, and he actually wanted to talk to me about bringing the fair back to Chicago and what my ideas were behind it. And I just remember, and again, I think this story kind of embodies who I am as a person, and it kind of embodies my my drive as an artist as well, because when the fair was in Chicago in the early '90s, there was a lot of inclusion and there was a lot of exclusion as an artist. You had to either know someone financially. I couldn't afford a ticket to go to the Vernissage, which was maybe, I think it was $500 a ticket at the time. And I used to show with Baroque International, which is part of Uncomfortable Spaces, which was a collective of galleries in Chicago. And mind you, I was only 19 or 20 years old. So I had to devise a way of, you know, what was the grand hustle that I can do to get my way, and how could I meet certain people from the art world, and how could I introduce myself and make myself known. So I came up with this idea of making bootleg passes that Tony and nobody really knew about. I literally made fake ID cards that I gave away to all my friends. And then we devised a plan that the way that we could actually get into the fair as well was some of my friends actually dressed up as caterers. And we would come.
Not collectors.
So, not collectors. So I was selling the bootleg. I was making and I wasn't selling them. I'm sorry. I was making and I was giving away the bootleg passes. And then I had another crew of friends that were pretending that they were the caterers. And we would just walk in and they'd have a different set of clothes, and then they'd take off their button-up tops and have their suits on. But we were, you know, all of us were really young artists. And that was, for me, the art fair was so important to us that we did anything by any means to get into it. And I think I told Tony that that is the kind of energy he should bring back again. He should bring back a fair that makes young artists want to be part of this community and to not feel excluded in any way. And, you know, I told him that possibly I might make some new bootleg passes to give away to the fair.
I think it's brilliant, and a brilliant way to end. I wonder if we have time for any questions. I'm not seeing a signal to the otherwise, so I'm happy to take some. Sir?
There's a microphone there.
We have a microphone coming.
You know, you have a wonderful focus on your heritage and your cultural
Thank you.
background, of which, and I saw your studio the other night, which was absolutely amazing.
Thank you.
But the other part of it is you are very different than, you know, your parents who hadn't gone to museums, just as an example.
Yeah.
And that difference, you know, what is the power that that is there that has made you so different, you know?
You know, I got to tell you, there's a few books that have had a really big impact on my life, and again, they're very unorthodox. One is the autobiography of Malcolm X by Alex Haley. The other one was Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill, and the third was the autobiography of Jackson Pollock. And I think that those three books pretty much sum up my practice and me as a person and how I think about things. But there's also this disconnect, which for me, I know that I know that I've made my parents proud, but I wish that there was more of a connection that they had with my work, which really isn't the fact, but it's okay. I mean, I think that disconnect still drives me to make that work even more.
There's a question in the back.
Oh. And thanks for coming, by the way, the other night. It was fun.
It's me again. I missed the studio because we just got here last night. From your early graffiti work and seeing the arc of your work to what you're doing today, and the arc that has followed graffiti art with Banksy and Fail and everybody, how do you think that your early graffiti work has influenced the others? I mean, the boat, obviously, but the things like the gold doily and all that sort of thing, the bobbin lace. Yeah. How do you?
I'll be very honest. There's no connection at all. I mean, for me, the energy is still there. The spirit and the energy for me personally is still there. And one thing that I've made very, very clear at a very young age is I made a very conscious decision to stop producing a certain body of work and then making a transition. Me personally, I have never been interested in seeing graffiti that's produced on the street in an institution. I've never been interested in that. Graffiti can be a very, very egotistical and very narcissistic and a one-sided community. But at the same time, it is the one community that I've never felt more at home, because you could be black, Jewish, Chinese, it doesn't matter. It really does, it crosses boundaries. I've never been part of a community that has been more inclusive than the hip hop culture and this graffiti community. But with that said, in my early 20s, I made a very conscious decision that I never wanted to produce. I made the mistake of trying to produce that work and putting it inside of a white cube in an institution, and I failed miserably. And I knew that I'd never wanted to produce that work again and have it inside of an institution. So I made a very conscious decision to stop doing that. I've still kept the name, which for me, again, which goes beyond graffiti, which for me is more about identity. It's a very personal connection. And again, it goes into this thing talking about the collective of like art in general. You know, why can a collective like art in general produce work and get notoriety, but a young person who has changed their name because they have an affiliation with street culture, why can they not keep their name and keep moving forward?
Can I just correct? Is it art and language you're speaking?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. Thank you. Art and language. Yes. Thank you. But it is important for me that there is a separation. For me, there's been only a few people that have been able to pull that off and pull it off the right way. Barry McGee is one of them, who's a very good friend of mine. And and again, I'm not trying to do what Barry does. Banksy obviously is is a brilliant artist, but they're kind of few and far between. There's a lot of artists that try to make that transition, and they're not very successful at all. I think because they are trying to sugarcoat it and they are trying to change their identity up, where for me, the bobbin lace and the excess and the customization and the doilies and the craft making, that's really me. That's really who I am. So I hope that answers your question.
I think we could do an entire panel on
yes.
the failure and the history of street art.
Yes.
But can I offer a little bit of a pushback on
Sure.
your statement where you said there was absolutely no relationship between that earlier work?
Mm-hmm.
Its migration to the gallery and what you're producing now. If you look on it on a completely sort of formal level, maybe a material level, yes, there's an incredible difference and they're two different bodies of work. But I think on a conceptual level, you've been very good about talking about this arc.
Yes.
Between the communities that you participate in as a non-artist,
yep.
and bring that kind of sort of aesthetic sensibility into a fine art practice.
I think you're right. I think I chose my words. I think I chose the wrong words. For me, but I did say that the energy is still there.
Right.
So, and for me, energy is a big word for me. I mean, people who know me on a personal level, that they know that I'm a big fan of energy. I just, no, seriously, like it sounds kind of kooky and kind of tree hugger and crystal work and whatnot. But
I hug trees. It's cool.
But listen, I am one of those few people. I don't drink, I don't smoke, I'm very much sober, and for me, I really, and I produce work with clarity, and I produce work that, for me, involves a lot of energy. And so, when I say the word energy, I think I mean several different things, which does go back to, having this arc. And and again, going back to the hip hop community and this graffiti community and being Latino and this producing work for a different social class. For me, that's all the same thing. And maybe I just don't like terms that put things in a box.
Absolutely, I think street art is useless. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
One last question.
Yes.
Sorry. What was your first piece of artwork that you sold that you called home to mom and dad, said, guess what, they're taking me serious?
God, it's such a great story. Okay. It wasn't necessarily a piece of artwork. I used to work for Leo Burnett, and I worked in the paste up room, and and I hope this story gets out to younger artists so it gives them some inspiration. I was a very, very conflicted person because I decided not to go to school. I'm self-taught, but I'm self-taught. And again, that was a very, very conscious decision that I made, not to go to school, because I found what was being taught to me was very repetitive. It was very insular. I didn't feel like I was part of that community, and I wanted something that spoke to me on a personal level. Not to mention that I was educating myself. I mean, if you come to my studio, I have an amazing library, and I basically, what they were trying to teach me in first year of art school, I had already known since I was 15 because I was reading about it, and because I was going to museums on my own with public transportation. So with that being said, I would make paintings, but I didn't quite feel very comfortable at trying to sell them. I remember clearly walking into Carl Hammer Gallery here in Chicago. I think I was like 18 or 19 years old, and I had my slides with me, and I think I gave Carl my slides, and I was like, you know, can you look at my work? And he looked at it, and he said, you know, it's good. Maybe you can use a little bit more practice. And I said, great, when's our show? And of course, he didn't give me a show. I went back to him again, I think with a painting under my arm, never sold anything, until I decided to really make a clean break mentally, which is very important. When you make that break mentally, that's when you can actually that's when things start to make sense and things start coming in. Finances can come in as well when you make that clean break. I remember working in the paste-up room, and I hated it, and I hated being there. And I just wanted to walk away from that and make art, and that's all I wanted to do. And an incident happened where I told my supervisor exactly what I thought of him. And as soon as I told him what I thought of him, I turned around and I just said, I am never, ever working for anyone ever again. I'm just gonna produce art, and I'm gonna be an artist. Sure enough, a week later, I'm painting on the street. Some people from Warner Brothers were driving around the city, specifically looking for me, asking me if I'd be interested in painting the Batman ride at Great America. So here I am in my early 20s, totally getting courted, thinking that I was gonna get arrested because I had no idea that people would drive up and actually look for you on the street, which they did. And that was one of my first gigs. But between that, the first paying gig was doing the backdrop for the MTV Music Awards. When I was 22 years old, and I was staying at the Four Seasons, and I ran up a $3,000 food and liquor bill. And I called my mom from the Four Seasons, and I was just telling her, I was like, Mom, you're never gonna believe this. Strawberries are $9.50, 2 eggs over easy is $14, and I had a $2,000 bottle of wine last night.
It's a good thing you don't drink anymore.
Exactly, and that's the reason I don't drink anymore. And that's the reason that MTV never called me back ever again.
Design,
So
thank you so very
much.
much for this dialogue.